Hello Euphoniums, this is Mr. Kruger again, and this is a lesson on Etude number 2. Alright, so when you first start learning this Etude, the first thing, as always, that you need to do is look over at your key signature. Okay, so we've got one flat. That's like your F scale, right? And since we have one flat, we know that B is going to be the only flat. And that means that we're not going to play E flats unless it's marked as a flat. And we're not going to play any A flats unless we see an A marked as a flat. So for instance, in measure 1, it's good to go ahead and mark a natural here because this is an E natural. Okay, so I marked that E natural. You might also mark the A natural right here. And you can mark those. It's smart, I think, to if you think you're going to miss them, go ahead and mark all of them in the whole etude. So you can mark all the E's, especially, and the A's. I want to point out also, if you look over here at measure 11, they mark an A flat. They also mark it in measure 12, right? And so we need to remember there's a rule with flats and sharps and naturals. Those are called accidentals. When they're marked, they carry until the bar line. And then, and so that means that every single A between here and the end of the measure is going to be an A flat unless it's marked otherwise. So this A is an A flat. So you see how I went ahead and I marked that A flat? You should go ahead and likewise mark that A flat. That's a really easy A flat to miss because you get used to all the A naturals. Okay. All right, so I think that's all the sharps and all the letter pitch stuff that we'll cover in this lesson for today. Okay, so the next thing we need to start to look at is the time signature, and we need to figure out our rhythms and how to count this piece. Okay, so we see here that the time signature is 4/4 time. Well, that's good because that's usually the first time signature that students learn to read in. So we're comfortable in 4/4 time. And so we know there's going to be 4 beats in a measure, and a quarter note's going to get the beat. So that's great. Okay. So there are a couple rhythms that may be new to you. I'm going to start down here in measure 9. Okay, now measure 9 starts with a quarter note on beat 1, but then we have something different here. You may not have seen this before. Do you see how these notes have a double beam right here? You know, over here we've got one beam. These are eighth notes, but here you got 2 beams that run parallel. That means that these are 16th notes. Okay, so these 4 notes right here are 16th notes, and the way we count 16th notes in 4/4 time, at Westbrook we count them 1 E enda, 2 E enda, 3 E enda, 4 E enda. Okay, so if we were in measure 9 here, we would count 1, then 2 E enda. All right, and that E natural is on and then we would go to 3, beat 3, and we'd count 8th notes, 3 and 4 and. So the whole measure would go 1, 2 E and 3 and 4 and. You see how that works? The same thing happens over here in measure 11 and in measure 14. These are all the same rhythms. Of course, notice that you tongue the 16th notes in measure 14. All the others are slurred. Also, when we go back to like measure 9, you're going to slur all the way through the E, but then you're going to tongue the F. So if you were going to play that, it would sound like to, to, to. You hear that? So a slurred to, but then tongue F, to. All right, so I might not be singing the pitches right, but that's how you would tongue that. Okay, that covers our 16th notes. Now, there's another rhythm that might not be familiar. It's a more advanced rhythm. It happens right here in measure 1. You see, we've got quarter notes on beat 1, and we end with quarter notes on beat 3 and 4. But here in beat 2, that might be new to you. That we call that a dotted eighth, and with a 16th note. Dotted eighth, 16th. That's what we call it. Okay, and right here, this is an eighth note because it has one beam. And you see it's got the dot next to it, so that's the dotted eighth. And this is the 16th note after the dotted eighth note because it's got the double beam. You see that? All right, so we have to figure out how to count the dotted 8/16th rhythm. Well, in order to get that, we first have to understand how long is the dotted eighth note. Okay, so I'm going to go over here to another sheet of paper to kind of explain this. So a dot, hopefully you learned this already, but here's a friendly reminder. A dot adds half of the note's original value. Okay, that's what a dot does. So for instance, hopefully in your first year of playing, you learned that a half note is 2 beats long, right? So I wrote half note equals 2. Well, then a dotted half note, it equals 2 plus half of 2, which is 1, right? And so we know that a dotted half note equals 3 beats. And that's all in 4/4 time. Of course, if you're in 9/8 time, that's different, like in your Etude number 1. Okay, but since a half note's 2 beats in 4/4 time, you would add that 1 beat, which is half of 2, and it's 3 beats long, right? Well, let's go down to eighth notes. How long is an eighth note in 4/4 time? It's usually half of a beat, right? All right, so an eighth note's half of a beat. Well, now we've got to do some tricky math here because we have 1/2, and then we have to add half of a half. Okay, so if you're dividing a half into 2, then you get quarters. You get 1/4. All right, so we've got 1/2 plus 1/4. Okay, well, how do we add those together? You got to get a common denominator. So we got to turn this half into fourths, so that's 2/4. 2/4 plus 1/4, that equals 3/4. Okay, and that's how long a dotted eighth note is. It's 3/4 of a beat. Well, how do we count fourths of a beat? That's might be a good question. Well, the answer is that we just did that when we counted 16th notes. All right, so when we counted these 16th notes, we put 4 of them into one beat. 1, 2 E and right, 2 E and 3. Okay, and so when we count 16th notes, we're counting quarters of the beat, and we need, if we go back over here to the dotted 8, we need 3 quarters for a dotted eighth note. So let's say it looks like a lot of these dotted eighth notes start on beat 2. If you have a dotted eighth note that starts on beat 2, then you would count it 2 E and. Okay, but in your music, they beam that dotted eighth note to a 16th note, right? So they have a 16th note connected to it, and so that 2 E and is followed by a 16th note on, it's on You see how that works? And so when you have a dotted 8/16th, the eighth note, the dotted eighth takes up 2 E and the 16th takes up the or duh, depending on how you prefer to count that. Okay, and so if we go back to the music, we would think, let me put on a metronome, because when we start doing 16th note subdivision, we really always we should use a metronome, but especially now. Okay. All right, so there's my metronome. I've got it on 64 beats per minute. I'm going slow because we're learning. When we start off, we need to go slow on fast things. So this, if I were going to count it, I would think 1, 2 E and 3. You see how my pencil moves with a 3? Watch that again. 1, 2 E and 3. 1, 2 E and 3. Now, if I take out the 2 E and, it'll sound like this. If I don't subdivide, 1, 2, 3. You see how that works? But I need to always think 2 E and, or this note won't be in the right spot. 1, 2, 3, 4. You see how you count that? And then measure 2 starts with eighth note, so we'd count 1 and 2, 3, 4, right? And so we have those dotted 8/16 sprinkled throughout the piece. I'm going to go ahead and count the whole thing for you, and I want you to try to finger, if you can, finger and get your E naturals or A naturals while I count. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 and 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, a 3, 4, and 1, 2, a 3. 1, 2, a 3, 4. 1, 2, a 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, and a 3, and 4, and 1, 2, a 3. 1, 2, and a 3, and 4, and 1, a 2, and 3. 1, a 2, a 3, and 4, and 1, 2, and a 3, and 4, and 1, a 2, and 3, a 4, and 1, 2, a 3. Off on 1. Hopefully that helps you learn this etude.